It's the 2022 World Cup.
It's the squad update for Australia. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and today we'll be updating Australia's squad for the 2022 World Cup. We've done a podcast on the groups which took a close look at Australia's team, as well as a player mediacast which went through each of the candidates for making the final squad. That ended with a prediction of the starters. And this mediacast is an addendum to that. In other words, we won't be repeating all of the information, but we'll simply be adding on to it. It's not necessary to have listened to that full-length version, but the conclusions that we draw here are based on that information and explained in more detail there. So we do recommend the full player podcast, but if we have time, we're hoping to release a player version focused solely on the final squad, giving the bios of just those 26 players who made the squad. Yes, and the final squad has been released. And for most teams, a preliminary squad too. For Australia, just the final squad. And today we'll find out how accurate we were in our predictions. We're going to list the names of the candidates that we consider definite, likely, and possible, and then announce who made the final squad. As we guessed, most squads had a few surprises, players who didn't make it, or new or unexpected players who did. And we'll go over those players and summarize everything again at the end. So we'll also discuss whether the selections and games played since June 2022 have changed our thoughts on our predicted starters and on the team's chances in the Cup. So let us move on. And shirt, let's talk about the shirt. Well, the colors, at least, kind of match the image on the YouTube screen with a kind of yellow and green trim. But unfortunately, what I'm wearing is a Brazil shirt. I think I've said in previous podcasts that I actually have an Australia shirt that I got from my brother, and I have misplaced it. Truth be told, I haven't put a lot of effort into finding it, but it's lost. So I hope the next time I do an Australia podcast, I will have the right shirt. And sorry for the poverty of shirts, Australian people. I hope the Brazil shirt is not offending you. Okay, let's move on to formations for recent games. So we kind of took a look at formations for Australia over the period, which the period covers basically the beginning of 2021 to the June 2022. And we did a kind of a closer analysis of the formations in the podcast there. Today, we're just focused on the recent matches. So those were two friendlies in Australia, one of them at home to New Zealand, which they won 1-0, and the other away against New Zealand, which they also won 2-0. And the first game, the first friendly at home there, the squad looked like it was basically a trial final squad. So most of the players who we think will be the starters for the final squad we saw in that lineup. However, the away match in friendly, which they actually won 2-0, by an even larger margin, was quite experimental, with only a few players who we think likely to be starters there. And, new players in, players playing out of position, all sorts of quirky stuff going on. Well, the formation for the first game there was a 4-3-3 formation. And that is actually a formation that they haven't used over the period we're talking about, 2021 to June 2022. And in game two, it was a 4-2-3-1. And that is a formation that they used about half the time in qualifying. They started with that formation in the first three games of qualifying, and then used it twice after that. And they also used it in a friendly before. So maybe it's good to think of Australia as a 4-2-3-1, although in truth they've used that lineup about half the time. Again, a closer analysis of the lineup was in that full-length podcast. So we move on at our blistering pace to look at the squad. And just let me find my place here. And we're going to go by just naming the candidates for the positions and their likelihood of reaching the squad. And after we've named them, we'll say which ones actually made it. And then at the end, in a summary, we'll kind of summarize. I'm aiming for a one-sentence summary of the period we're talking about, so 2021 to June 2022, and then one sentence on the September friendlies to see how things are shaping up in that position. So we begin with the manager, Arnold Graham, and believe it or not, he has made the squad. And yes, he has made the squad. We're going to save the discussion for who we think are starters towards the end, but I'll give you a hint as to what's coming. Arnold Graham is the starting manager. Okay, and we talked in the full podcast about Bert van Marwijk, the previous manager, who is now being replaced. Let's talk about goalkeepers then. We had definite candidates in Matthew Ryan, often called Matty Ryan, and Danny Vukovic. And we had a likely candidate in Andrew Redmayne. And we won't talk about anything below the possible level. We have no possible candidates there, and we will actually erase the one possible but unlikely candidate we have. So with just 3 candidates, you can pretty much guess that all of them made it. So Matthew Ryan selected for the squad, Danny Vukovic and Andrew Redmayne will be the 3 Australian goalkeepers. And Matty Ryan has been the starter throughout the period from early 2021 to June 22, and he started the first of the September friendlies. It was Andrew Redmayne who started the second, so maybe tipping his hand a little bit as to who the backup keeper is, but we may talk about that a bit more at the end. Actually, I do want to talk about one player who seemed to be off the squad because it's an interesting story. It was Mitchell Langerak. So Mitchell Langerak actually came out of retirement. He hadn't appeared since October 2019. And he came out of retirement to appear on the bench. And in a couple of articles I read, the critics seemed to see him as a second string keeper, calling Vukovic and Redmayne both as third string keepers. And then they were surprised when Langerak was not chosen for the final squad. Langerak was actually on the bench for both of the September friendlies. And so they thought he was making a comeback. But alas, he wasn't selected. Okay, just a little side note there. Let's move on to central defenders, and we will list the candidates. We have in the definite category Trent Sainsbury and Harry Sutar, and then in the likely category Milos Degenek and Bailey Wright, and in the possible category Kai Rolls, Gianni Stensness, I always have trouble with that name, Gianni Stensness and Ryan McGowan, and we'll erase the others from the list. And we begin with a bit of a shock here, actually. Trent Sainsbury was not selected for the squad, despite being a definite candidate by us. It's a really shocking turn, especially since he's the manager's son-in-law. Can you imagine what the effect that that'll have on the family dynamics? Actually, Trent Sainsbury had started the first September friendly, but then wasn't called up for the second. And a bit of investigation revealed that he had been struggling at the game level and hadn't played for several weeks for his Qatar club. He's with Al Wakra in Qatar. And we actually posed that, you know, his move to a Qatar club was probably beneficial for the national team. But holy smokes, he was not chosen. I'm gobsmacked. We also, okay, so next we have Harry Sutar, and he was selected for the squad. He was a bit of an injury concern. He had a cruciate ligament rupture before, and we mentioned that in the previous podcast, he was expected back November 14th. Well, it's actually November 11th today, but he returned to fitness in late October, so a little bit earlier than expected, and is available for the squad. Milos Degenek, the likely candidate, was selected, as was Bailey Wright. And Kai Rolls, the possible candidate. Actually, I've since learned that the manager favours him, so we might have considered him a likely candidate. But Kai Rolls was also a bit of an injury concern, a metatarsal fracture as of early September, and he had been expected back October 31st. And indeed, he did return to action with his club on November 6th. So not an injury concern, Kai Rolls. And we do have a new candidate here, and so we'll get rid of the candidates who were not selected. So Stensness and Ryan McGowan were not selected, and rather Thomas Deng was brought in, the new candidate. And since we didn't talk about him in the previous podcast, we'll introduce him here. So he actually returned after a 3-year absence in September 2022 to start one of their 2 remaining games, and he was subbed in for the other one. So that cap combines with his cap before that absence. So he has 2 caps since 2018 and is 25 years old, and he plays in Japan for Albirex Niigata, a recent move since 2022. So there we go. Not as young as all that, 25 years old, but new to the squad, Thomas Deng. So let's review the position here, what's been going on. And we were actually confused even before September with a switch from the regulars Trent Sainsbury and Milos Degenek to Rolls and Wright for the playoff game. So a really important game, and he kind of switched to a new pairing. In September, though, it seemed to return to the regulars with Sainsbury and Degenek in the first of the September friendlies. And, you know, they got a clean sheet there, so kind of all looked well. However, in the second game, Deng, the new player, and Delbridge, who ultimately wasn't selected, was a surprise use in the second friendly there in September. So, yeah, not really sure what's going on. Of course, the regular pairing, Sainsbury and Degenek, Sainsbury is out, so we'll have to see. At the end of the podcast, we'll talk about who we think are going to be starters, so we'll return to this issue then. Let's move on to left backs, and as a definite candidate, we have Aziz Behic, and as a possible candidate, Craig Goodwin and Joel King. And that's as far as we'll go. The other ones we'll erase from the list. And in terms of who made the squad, Aziz Behic did make the squad, as did Craig Goodwin. And Joel King also made the squad. So all 3 of our definite and possible candidates making the squad there. And in terms of a summary of the position, it was mostly Behic in the period from early 2021 to June 2022, with King as the main replacement when Behic wasn't there. And then Behic started the first of the September friendlies, where they kind of used what seemed to be the starting squad, and King got some field time in the second experimental squad. Again, we'll return to this when we talk about who we think are going to be starters. Moving on to right backs, we have a definite candidate, Fran Karasic, and we have possible candidates, Ryan Grant and Nathaniel Atkinson. Okay, so we will erase Josh Ridden there. And in terms of who made it, we have Fran Karasic making the squad, Grant Ryan not making the squad, Not a huge surprise because he was only a possible candidate, but Nathaniel Atkinson making the squad. So in a summary of the position from early 2021 to June 2022, it kind of ended as a rotation of Karakic and Atkinson. Perhaps Atkinson was preferred as he played both of those important playoff games that got them to the World Cup. And Karasic, though, started the first of the September friendly, and Atkinson started the second. So perhaps rotating in that position. All right, we are ready to move on to the midfield, and we're going to combine defensive midfielders and central midfielders and kind of introduce them and then talk about them as one when we summarize the positions. So for defensive midfielders, we have a definite candidate in Jackson Irvine, and we have possible candidates with Kenny Dougal, James Jago, and Connor Metcalf. And let's see who made the squad. So Jackson Irvine did make the squad. However, all three of those, Kenny Dougal, James Jago, and Connor Metcalf, were left off the squad. And instead, two new candidates were brought into the squad. So big changes there. First new candidate is Keanu Bacchus. And the second is Cameron Devlin. So we'll introduce those because we didn't meet them in our full-length podcast. Keanu Bacchus got his first and only appearance as a substitute in one of those September friendlies. So that is his first cap for Australia. And he is 24 years old and plays for St Mirren in Scotland. Cameron Devlin also got his first appearance, but it was on the bench in September, and he didn't start either of the two games, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for the other. So one cap for Cameron Devlin, and he is 24 years old, and he plays for Heart of Midlothian, also in Scotland, having moved over from the Newcastle Jets in 2021. So both of those newcomers to the squad, and we are erasing some players that we thought were possible candidates there. All right, let's look at central midfielders before summarizing the position. And we have no definite candidates here, actually, but Aaron Moy as a likely candidate. That may be a surprise, but we explained in the full-length podcast why we thought that he was just likely. It would have been a surprise, a huge surprise, to be honest, if he was left off. But anyway, and Riley McGree, also a likely candidate. So, and both of those players made it. I'm just going to highlight those new candidates because they made the squad. Aaron Moy then and Riley McGree both making the squad, and now we can summarize the kind of central midfield, defensive midfield. So these positions were quite steady with Jackson Irvine and actually attacking midfielder Frostic. And then after that, Irvine and Moy as a pairing, as a starting pair. However, things became quite confusing at the end with all sorts of new players tried out. So that continued into the September friendlies with Irvine as the lone central midfielder in the first game. So no surprise there. But General and Metcalf tried out in the second. And then neither of those two made the final squad. But as we saw, they had to make way for Bacchus and Devlin, two new players added to the squad. So a bit of confusion in the midfield there, but perhaps more among the secondary players than among the starting players. So we'll review that at the end. And here we'll move on to left midfielders. So actually, we don't have any candidates. We had one possible but unlikely candidate who didn't make the squad. And on the right midfielder, I might as well do that at the same time, we had no candidates over there. So imagine the left midfield and right midfielder as say a 4-3-3 formation, and they would be the outside midfielders in that three. So they very rarely use that 4-3-3 formation that employs this position. But when they do, it's usually attacking midfielder Aiden Frostic. And he was there in the first of the September friendlies. They used that 4-3-3, and the position was not used in the second game. And same on the right side, the position rarely used, but used in the first September friendly. And in that case, it was central midfielder Aaron Moy playing in that position. So kind of a central midfield position, but just off to the left a little bit. We move on to left wingers. And here we have no definite candidates, but a likely candidate in Matthew Leckie. And I'm actually moving attacking midfielder our Mabille from the attacking midfield to the left wing position, and in fact he's a definite candidate. So we have definite candidate our Mabille and Matthew Leckie. I made that change because our Mabille has been playing on the left side, so he's worth considering here. Okay, and those are the only two candidates, everyone else being possible but unlikely or less. And both of these candidates have made the squad. So our Mabille will be on the squad, and Matthew Leckie also. So we'll come back. Oh no, I'll summarize the position first. So this position is usually left attacking midfield or left winger. It could even be left forward if there's a three-man forward line. And Leckie and Mabille shared the position for most of the period from early 2021 to June 2022. But this too became a bit muddled in the last few games. In the September friendlies, it was Mabille, so that was kind of expected. And then in the second game, right winger Tilo, who ultimately was not selected. So that's how it went in the September friendlies. And let's take a look at the right side, the right wingers. There we have definite candidate Martin Boyle. And the player we just mentioned, Marco Tilio, sorry, I think I called him Tilo before, Marco Tilio as a likely candidate there. And we also have a possible candidate in Brandon Borello. So three candidates here. Let's see who made it. So Martin Boyle, no surprise, our definite candidate, made it. However, a bit of a surprise in that Marco Tilio was not selected for the squad, despite playing the last of the September friendlies. I guess he didn't impress the coach enough there. Brandon Borello also did not make the squad. So there we have it. Let's summarize the right wing position. It's usually, like on the left, a right attacking midfielder or right winger role, and perhaps even a right forward role. And it was almost always Boyle, Martin Boyle, in World Cup qualification, including the playoff games. And Boyle did start the first of the September friendlies. And interestingly, the left winger Matthew Leckie started on the right in the second September game. Okay, moving on to forwards, we include attacking midfielders in the forward line. And the candidates here are definite candidate Aiden Frostic. And we also had our Mobile here as a definite candidate, but we moved him over to the left wing. We have as a likely candidate Denis Jean-Rowe, and as a possible candidate, Tom Rojic. Okay, and the players who made the squad are Aiden Frostic, so no surprise there. We saw that our Mabille did make it. But surprisingly, Denis Jean-Rowe did not make the squad. he hadn't been a starter for Australia, but he was called up quite often, so a bit of a surprise there. And it's less of a surprise to us than it seems to be for some reporters that Tom Rodgick did not make the squad. We only had him as a possible candidate, so a lot of our possible candidates are not making the squad. But his absence was seen as, or his non-selection was seen as a big surprise. They called it a snub, actually. I wouldn't quite go that far. He had also withdrawn from the playoff games for personal reasons, but he had been considered back in the picture after joining West Bromwich Albion in England in 2022. However, the manager did not select him. And we'll finish here with a summary of the position. So Rodgick actually had been the central attacking midfielder when the formation called for it. However, it wasn't used that much in the period from early 2021 to June 2022. We saw it was used in the 4-3-3 in the September games, and it was Riley McGree who played that role. And and that was in the second September friendly. Sorry, the position hadn't been used in the first September friendly. So there we have it. A couple of surprises there. Okay, finally we have the forwards, and we have definite candidate Duke Mitchell and likely candidate Jamie McLaren. And then we had three possible candidates in Adam Taggart, Nicholas D'Agostino, and Bruno Fornaroli. And the players who made it are Duke Mitchell, our definite candidate, and Jamie McLaren, the likely candidate. However, none of the other three made it. Adam Taggart, Nicholas D'Agostino, or Bruno Fornaroli. None of those players made it. And rather, like before, we have two new candidates being called into the squad. So the first of these is a bit of a young superstar right now, Garang Kuol, and the second is Jason Cummings. So we'll introduce those players since they did not appear in our full-length podcast. So Garang Kuol got his first appearance on the bench in September 2022, and he didn't start either of those two games, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for the other. So that gives him one cap in his career with Australia, and he is just 18 years old, Garang Kuol. The other candidate is Jason Cummings. He was born in Scotland, actually. His first and only appearance was a start in the second game there in September. And that gives him one cap. And he got a goal in that game as well. So a good start for him. He is 27 years old. He actually was trying to make the Scotland squad. So in 2017 and 18, he got two caps for Scotland, but now has thrown his lot in with Australia. Plays for Central Coast Mariners in Australia, and prior to that was with Dundee in Scotland and Shrewsbury in England. So Garang Kuol and Jason Cummings added to the squad at the expense of some of our possible candidates, and we'll finish just by summarising the position. Or summarize what's been going on the forward line. So actually, it's always been a bit unsettled up at the top there. With Adam Leckie, even attacking midfielders, Adam Leckie, with attacking midfielders Leckie and Trustic sometimes called in to play as the forward. In the September friendlies, it was Taggart in one game and then Duke in the other. But as we saw, Taggart went unselected. So a bit of a struggle for goals up front for Australia. And I suppose that helps to explain why they're bringing in new players. Okay, as we said, we'll come back and take a look at these players again to both summarize them and to predict who are going to be starters. Meanwhile, we'll just go over a few things. So for statistics, we gave statistics for all the candidates who had played for the team from 2021 in the main podcast. Now we're going to give the same statistics just for these 26 players. So the average age of Australia is 27.5. That's fairly old, actually. And they have 9 players who are 30 years or older, and only 2 players who are 22 or younger. So kind of balanced in favor of veterans or older players there. And the key ones are Aaron, none of them are too old, actually. Andrew Redmayne is 33 years old. Goalkeeper Danny Vukovic is 37 years old. And Behich and Moya, 32 years old. Lecky and Duke, 31. So not too old, that. At the other end of the scale, I think they have one of the youngest players in the tournament as Garang Kuol. He's 18, and the next oldest player is 22 years old, Joel King. So, definitely balanced in favor of the older players. However, that age doesn't really give them great experience. The average number of caps is 21.2, and that's a lot lower than other teams in terms of caps per player. Despite the age coming in a bit inexperienced. Total goals for Australia is 74. That also is very low. I would say I've only done 4 teams here, so it's hard to say. But when we did it for it doesn't matter what it was for in the full podcast, because it was a totally different set of players. But take my word for it, it is very low. Brazil, one of the highest scoring teams, has 161, so more than twice as many goals. And the total goals per cap, just a measure we do to compare teams, is 13.5%. So actually, that's not bad. Considering the total goals make it look like a problem. Total goals per cap is actually slightly above average. The average was 13.1 in the full-length podcast. However, we have seen that they do have trouble scoring goals. So we went into a bit more analysis on that in the full-length podcast, so we won't repeat all that here. Rather, we'll get on with things. So we're going to do a few summaries here, and the first is notable non-selections. So we talked about them above, so we'll just mention them by name here. But again, some reporters saw Michel Langerak as the goalkeeper as a surprise non-selection. He hadn't actually played since October 2019, but did come back for the September friendlies, but that proved kind of false bait because he wasn't selected. So dangling a possibility in front of him and his fans, but that didn't pan out. A true surprise non-selection, though, one of the biggest in the World Cup, I think, is Trent Sainsbury not being selected. So as I say, I'm just amazed by that. Okay, anyway, we'll move on. Denis Jean-Rowe, the attacking midfielder, also a surprise non-selection. We had him as a likely candidate. We had Trent Sainsbury as a definite candidate. And then not so much for us, but for judging by articles I've read, Tom Rodgick, we only had him as a possible candidate, but the reports seem to focus on him as a surprise non-selection. Surprise inclusions. Well, I suppose Langerak would have been a surprise inclusion if he was selected, but we don't really have anyone in this category. I mean, some of the new players are surprise inclusions, but we have a separate category for new players, which we will do right now. So 5 new players for Australia. Central defender Thomas Deng, the first among them, and then 2 defensive midfielders, Keanu Bacchus and Cameron Devlin. And then 2 forwards, Garang Kuol, of whom there's much excitement being there's a lot of excitement about him. Okay, I lost my syntax there. I'll admit it. And Jason Cumming. So Garen Cool and Jason Cumming, hopefully they will put the ball in the net for Australia, because that's been a problem for them. As far as injuries, we've divided it into a few categories. So first category for injury is recovered from injury. So Harry Sutar, the central defender, has recovered from his injury, actually came back a bit earlier than expected. And also central defender Kai Rolls has recovered from his injury. So the manager very happy to have those players back. Injury doubts, but still on the roster. We have Martin Boyle. I think I didn't mention this above, so I'll mention it here. He has knee problems, and he is expected back on November 14th. So that's cutting it pretty close. Yeah, I read an article on it. So he is going to remain on the squad. The manager really wants him there. He's going to be flown to Qatar after his last club game, and then they're going to check him out once he gets there. So it's possible he'll be replaced, or it's possible he maybe miss the first game or something like that. Or from Australia's point of view, of course, they hope he'll be fit to play. Aidan Trustic also is out with an ankle injury that kept him out from October 24th. The selection was made after that, and the manager says he's already fit and is even going to play for his club before the Cup. So his ankle injury, a big worry when it happened, but turns out to not really be a problem. We don't have anyone dropped due to injury. I'm kind of thinking that we did. Anyway, I have it here that we don't. And injured, we have players who were injured, but they weren't strong candidates in the first place. So Alex Wilkinson, we had him as possible, but unlikely. He's got a groin injury, expected back December 31st after the Cup. So if he was a consideration for the coach, that would have ruled him out. Possible candidate, Adam Taggart. And I read that this injury and his form also were given as the reason for his non-selection. But he was only a possible candidate there anyway. And finally, Bruno Fornaroli. He has an ankle injury with an unknown return date. I also think he got in a bit of trouble with his club. I think he refused to sub into a game or something like that. I don't know if that played into the decision at all, but the ankle injury probably did. All right, well, now we move on to the last part of the podcast, or the second last part, the predicted starters. And I got to do a quick edit to populate this list. Boop, there we go, just like magic. Okay, we have goalkeepers. So, sorry, the manager. So Graham Arnold will be there. So we'll call him a starter, manager Graham Arnold. And goalkeepers. For candidates, or for the successful candidates there, Matthew Ryan, Danny Vukovic, and Andrew Redmayne will be the goalkeepers. And we had predicted Matty Ryan as the starter, and we remain certain of that. But here I'll also just mention a little bit about the backup. So Redmayne's recent start suggested a challenge to Vukovic for second string keeper, especially since Vukovic wasn't selected for the September games. He gave way to Langerak, who came out of retirement to appear on the bench. And we mentioned the story that some critics had seen Langerak as the second string keeper coming in to resume his spot. However, he wasn't chosen for the final squad. So nevertheless, we're really dealing with the starters, and Matty Ryan almost certainly the starter there. Central defenders, well, we were confused. Oh, I'll do the candidates first. So the shocking non-selection of Trent Sainsbury. but we do have Harry Suter back from injury, Milos Degenek and Bailey Wright, and Kai Rolls also overcoming his injury, and then new candidate Thomas Deng. So 5 candidates there. And we were confused by some late changes in June, and we were forced to hedge our prediction and thought it might be a rotation of 2 different pairings. But I won't even mention the candidates. That all seemed blown up now with Sainsbury. He was one of the players in the pairing, not chosen. And the other one was Rolls. I think it was Rolls and Wright. So that might be a pairing. In fact, the manager said that Sutar and Rolls had done exceptionally well. I used air quotes there. And perhaps that gives us insight into who the starters will be. However, there hasn't been any confirmation of starting lineups with Sutar and Rolls back from injury. We're not really sure how much they would have played if they weren't injured. So I'm really not going to predict anyone. I do kind of think Harry Sutar is going to be one of the starters, but we really don't have any evidence, so I'm just going to leave that blank. Okay, left back, we had nominated Behic as the starter, and we remain firm on that. Right back, we continue to see the right back as a bit of a rotating position. We slightly favor Atkinson. We slightly favor Nathaniel Atkinson, but we're going to call it a rotating position, or that could mean one of the two, and we're not really sure about it. In defensive midfield, we have a lot of chopping and changing, especially in the latter games of the period. That leaves us with no great confidence in our pick, but we are going to stick with Jackson Irvine and Aaron Moy as the main men. So taking a bit of a bet on that one. Left midfielders and right midfielders, we have no starters there. Left wingers, we had predicted Leckie would be a starter, though perhaps not necessarily in this role. That role being left winger, left attacking midfielder, or left forward, but somewhere on the field. And that was supported by him starting on the right side as a right attacking midfielder for one of the September friendlies. So we maintain that Matthew Leckie is going to be a starter. We're just not sure where he's going to start on the field. And we're going to label our Mobile as a sometimes starter because we're not confident that he will start, but we think he will get some starts at least. On the right side, it's a bit more straightforward. We think Martin Boyle is definitely going to be the starter there. Any challenge might have come from Marco Tilio there, but Tilio was a surprise non-selection. And in the attacking midfield, we had predicted Hrustic as a starter, though really as anything but an attacking midfielder. So usually plays in the central midfield in the period we're talking about, and sometimes even as a forward. So, but we're still going to nominate him as a starter somewhere on the field. And now we'd have to say McGree as a sometimes starter as central attacking midfield. Actually, I'm not going to commit to that because they don't use that position often enough. Okay, and I think I've lost McGree from my list here. Oh, no, wait, I have found him. He is actually a central midfielder. I should have pointed that out, even though he seems to be playing in a bit more of an attacking role. So Miley McGree, he was a likely central midfielder, and I seem to have overlooked him there. Anyway, let's move on to the forwards finally. So we have Mitchell Duke, as a okay. Let me just discuss the thinking on that. We had been able to predict only Duke here as a sometime starter. We said it was a bit unclear up at the top as a sometime starter, and we actually think the forward is going to be kind of a trial position. We think they're going to try out candidates, maybe that new youngster Garan Kuol, and choose and go with whoever produces. Given that Duke and McLaren have not been really satisfactory in terms of scoring, so we're not really going to nominate a character here. Probably Duke and Mitchell will be considered, but let's say they start Kuol in the first game and he really takes off, then Duke and McLaren may not get any starts. So we're going to leave that blank because we're not sure. All right. Well, closing thoughts on Australia. Again, we won't repeat everything that we've said in the podcast, in the team and player podcast. Really, the question we're answering here was, does the selection that we've seen change our opinion about their chances? Well, honestly, we didn't give great chances to Australia or great prospects to Australia. We feel the team is a bit weaker than it's been in past editions, and even in past editions, they didn't pass the group stage. I think actually the Trent Sainsbury decision is odd, doing it so late and so suddenly. I mean, obviously, they have reasons that we may not be privy to. I'm not being a fan of Australia, not watching kind of all of their games and all of their progress. Perhaps it made more sense to Australian fans, but nevertheless, it's a big loss. They obviously have problems up front scoring. And so as much as I like Australia, I don't see them with much chance of getting out of the group stage here. So anyway, we're trying to keep our comments brief here. So that brings us to the end of this podcast. So keep in mind, we may be editing together a list of the bios of the 26 final candidates if we have time. So if we do that, it'll just be outtakes from the main player podcast. Kind of an editing project rather than a new recording. And if it comes out, it'll probably be within the first few days of the Cup. I personally would really like to have a podcast like that. Meanwhile, keep an eye on us at Soccerphiles Canada. That's Soccerphiles. Oh, I better put up the closing graphic for the YouTube watchers. That's Soccerphiles with a PH in the middle and an S at the end, and our website soccerphiles.captivate.fm. And check the show notes, and also no, that's it. There is no also. I hope I see you in our next podcast, and bye-bye for now.